Mark was staring at the phone on the nightstand. And for the first time in 12 years, the man who built bridges for a living felt like his own world was suspended by a single fraying thread. The screen flickered. A notification from Sarah Jim. It said, "I can still smell your perfume on my sheets." Mark felt a surge of nausea so violent he had to grip the edge of the dresser. Sarah was the name of the woman 3 doors down. A woman his wife, Chloe, claimed to despise because of a dispute over a property line fence. But Chloe was in the shower, the steam curling under the door, the muffled sound of her humming a pop song echoing off the tiles. She sounded happy. She sounded innocent. Mark picked up the phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. He did something he had never done in a decade of marriage. He swiped. He tapped the contact. He hit the call button. He held the phone to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 1 ring. 2. Then a voice picked up. It wasn't a woman's voice. It was deep, resonant, and unmistakably masculine. "Hey, baby, you back in bed already?" Mark didn't breathe. He didn't make a sound. He hung up and placed the phone back on the nightstand, exactly where it had been, down to the millimeter. The humming in the shower stopped. The water clicked off. Mark stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, his mind already spinning. He didn't just have a cheating wife. He had a neighbor who was comfortable enough to answer her calls with "baby" at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday. This was the American dream in the suburbs of North Carolina. Manicured lawns, high-end SUVs in every driveway, and a homeowners association that would fine you $50 if your trash can stay out an hour past noon. It was a world of status, and Mark and Chloe were the golden couple. He was the structural engineer. She was the interior designer with the perfect Instagram feed. But Mark knew something about structures. If the foundation is poured with salt, the whole house is eventually coming down. Over the next week, Mark became a ghost in his own life. He watched Chloe with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. He noticed the way she tilted her screen away, the way she started wearing expensive lace underwear to the gym. But the most painful part was the gaslighting. One night, over a dinner of organic salmon and overpriced wine, Mark tested the waters. He mentioned he saw David, the neighbor next door, out jogging. Chloe didn't even flinch. She just rolled her eyes and sighed. Ugh, David is such a narcissist. Honestly, Mark, I don't know how Elena stand him. He's so oily. I can barely stand to look at him when we're at the HOA meetings. She said it with such conviction, such curated disgust, that for a split second, Mark almost doubted his own ears. But he knew that voice on the phone. He knew the cadence. He knew the betrayal was already deep in the marrow of his life. He needed an ally, and he knew exactly who was being hurt just as much as he was. Elena was a neighborhood power boss. She was a high-level executive at a private equity firm, a woman who wore power suits like armor and drove a black G-Wagon that cost more than most people's houses. She was the one who actually owned the mansion next door. David was essentially her high-end accessory. Mark invited her over under guise of discussing a drainage issue between their properties. He didn't do it in the house. He did it in his backyard workshop, away from Chloe's ears. When Elena walked in, she looked impatient. She looked like a woman whose time was worth $1,000 an hour. "Mark, I hope this is quick. I have a closing in London at midnight." Mark didn't say a word. He pulled out his laptop and slid a pair of headphones toward her. He had spent the last 48 hours installing hidden microphones in his own living room. He hit play. Elena listened. Her face didn't crumble. It did something much more terrifying. It turned to stone. She heard her husband, David, laughing about how Elena was married to her spreadsheets while he was married to Chloe's bed. She heard him joke about how he'd eventually divorce Elena once he'd squeezed enough out of her family's trust to set himself up for life. Elena took the headphones off. She didn't cry. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick leather-bound file. She dropped it on the workbench with a heavy thud. "I've had a private investigator on David for 6 months, Mark," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I knew he was straying. I just didn't know it was into your house. And I didn't know he was planning a financial exit. He thinks he's an architect, but he's really just a parasite." She opened the file. It was filled with photos. David and Chloe at a hotel in the city. David and Chloe in the back of his SUV. But there was something else. Documents. David has been skimming from our joint investment accounts to fund a consulting firm in Chloe's name, Elena whispered. "They aren't just sleeping together, Mark. They're stealing from me to build a life together after they dump us." Mark felt a cold, dark satisfaction. "You want a divorce?" Elena looked him dead in the eye. "A divorce is a legal transaction. I want a total liquidation. I want them to lose the house, the cars, the reputation, and every cent they think they've secured. Are you in?" Mark nodded. "I'm an engineer, Elena. I know exactly which load-bearing walls to hit. Phase 1 was a trust trap. Mark's grandfather had left him a massive inheritance, held in a trust that Chloe had been eyeing for years. She thought it matured on their 10th anniversary, which was only 3 days away. She was staying with Mark just long enough to get her hands on that moral turpitude clause, except she didn't realize the clause worked both ways. If the spouse was found guilty of documented adultery, they were legally barred from ever touching a cent of the principal. Mark had the footage. He had the audio. He just needed the right stage to reveal it. The stage was the annual Founders Day block party. It was a social event of the year. The mayor was there. The local press was there. The entire HOA board was there, sipping cocktails and judging each other's landscaping. Chloe was wearing a white silk dress, looking like a literal angel. David was at the grill, playing the great American neighbor, flipping burgers and cracking jokes with the man. They were playing their roles perfectly. As the sun began to set, Mark stood up on the patio, clinking his glass. The crowd went silent. "I want to make a special announcement," Mark said, his voice booming across the lawn. "As many of you know, Chloe and I are celebrating our 10th anniversary this week, and there's been a lot of talk about the family trust maturing." Chloe beamed, her eyes sparkling with greed. She reached out to take his hand. "But before we celebrate the future," Mark continued, his tone, he pointed a remote at the giant inflatable movie screen the HOA had set up for the kids' movie later that night. "Mark, what are you doing?" Chloe whispered, her smile faltering. "This isn't the time." "Oh, it's exactly the time, honey," Mark said, stepping back. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a slideshow of their wedding photos. It was a high-definition recording from the hidden camera in their bedroom. The audio blasted through professional-grade speakers. It was David's voice, clear as a bell, talking about how predictable and boring Mark was. Then came Chloe's voice, laughing as she described how she was going to use Mark's inheritance to buy a villa in Tuscany for her and David. The silence that hit the crowd was physical. It was a vacuum. People stopped chewing. The mayor put down his drink. Chloe froze. She looked like a deer caught in high-intensity stadium lights. David, standing by the grill, turned pale as a sheet. He looked toward his own house, looking for Elena, looking for an escape. But Elena was already standing next to Mark. She wasn't hiding anymore. She held up a stack of legal papers. "David," she called out, her voice cutting through the silence like a guillotine. "The locks on the house were changed 20 minutes ago. Your bags are in the gutter. And since you used my family's money to fund your little consulting business with Chloe, my lawyers have already filed a freeze on those accounts. You don't have a house, you don't have a job, and as of 5 minutes ago, you don't have a wife." Chloe finally found her voice. She turned to Mark, tears streaming down her face, the same practiced tears she'd used for years to get her way. "Mark, please. It was a mistake. He manipulated me. You can't do this to me. Think of our life." Mark looked at her, and for the first time, he felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pain, just the piece of a job well done. "The life you're talking about was built on a lie, Chloe." Mark said quietly. "And as an engineer, I can't let a faulty structure stand. The trust fund? It's already been signed over to a charity for displaced families. You're not getting a dime. In fact, according to the post-nup you signed last year, the one you didn't read because you were too busy texting Sarah Jim, you're leaving this house with exactly what you brought into it." He paused, letting the weight of it sink in, which was a suitcase and a set of keys to a car that's currently being towed. The neighborhood watched as the golden couple of the suburbs disintegrated in real time. David tried to say something, to maintain some shred of his cool neighbor persona, but a group of men he used to play poker with turned their backs on him. He was a pariah, in a world built on status. He was now zero. Chloe stood alone in the middle of the lawn, her white dress now looking like a shroud. She looked around at the faces of her friends, her neighbors, the people she had lied to for years. No one moved to help her. No one offered a shoulder. Mark walked off the patio, leaving the screen playing the loop of their betrayal. He walked past David, who was staring at his feet. "Hey, David," Mark said, stopping for just a second. "Nice grill. Too bad you won't be invited to the next one." Mark got into his truck. He didn't look back at the Craftsman house. He didn't look back at the manicured lawn. He drove out of the subdivision, past the HOA signs and the white picket fences. He had spent his career making sure things stayed up, but as he watched the suburb vanish in his rear-view mirror, he realized that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can build is a fire that burns the past away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. He had one last text to send. He sent it to the number saved as Sarah Jim. It said, "The foundation is clear. Time to start something new."